Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Redwater wore the morning like a wrapper tied tight across the waist, neat and careful, patterned with news that traveled faster than bicycles and whispers that flew like egrets across the mangrove canals. Roosters argued with the dawn, the mill's saws cleared their throats, and the mango tree by the market kept court for elders whose hands cracked cola and whose tongues measured truth like pepper sold in milk tins. Children ran with dust halos around their ankles, hawkers tuned their voices to the key of hunger, and the river behind the timber yard breathed like an old man who had made peace with pain. In that town, faces were familiar and footsteps recognized. A door closing after sunset could tell a story, and a cough behind a curtain could betray a secret. Jonas moved through that tapestry like a bold thread, tall and barrel-chested, the kind of man whose greeting filled the air even after he had passed, whose laughter, thick with palm wine and pride, could lift or bruise a room depending on which way it fell. People said his shoulders were made for lifting logs and carrying leadership, but they also said pride, like a restless goat, breaks any rope eventually. Mary, his wife, was the quiet between waves, slim and steady, her voice the soft side of a drum that only the careful hands of patience could play. She walked as if the earth were a sleeping child and she was determined not to wake it. When she bargained for tomatoes, her smile did the heavy lifting. When she fetched water, even the bucket seemed to glide. When she listened, people felt their burdens rearrange themselves into something bearable. In their first years together, smiles sat easily between them like friends who refused to leave after supper. Jonas brought fish from the river or stories from the mill, and Mary turned them into meals or gentle laughter that warmed their single room and made the raffia mat feel like a king's bed. Life was not a festival, but there were yam harvests that made the house smell like memory. There were evenings of harmattan tea that opened the chest, and there were walks past the hibiscus hedge where their shadows stitched themselves into one. But seasons teach lessons rain cannot, and slowly, almost politely, something inside the house shifted its chair, not loudly enough to alarm anyone, but firmly enough to demand space. Jonas found the courtyard humming with male voices on more nights, stories unspooling like fishing lines, jokes gathering like storm clouds, the air thick with roasted meat, smoke, and the soft arrogance that follows men who mistake noise for wisdom. Sometimes the talk of men is a canoe that forgets the strength of the river, and in Redwater, a laugh can turn sharp like a fish bone caught in the throat. Jonas's friends came like weather. Kobe with a swagger polished in Abaddon's crowded motor parks, boasting of deals that smelled like diesel and daring. Elias, lean as a reed, with Enugu dust in his shoes and a tongue that could slice yam without a knife. Robin, broad and restless, as if Worry's tide pulled at his ankles even inland, a man whose eyes scanned rooms like a hawk searching fields. They liked Jonas because his gate was always ajar, his calabash always tilted, and his pride made a good drum for their flattery. They sat beneath the guava that leaned into the compound wall, banging cups against their knees, arguing about football as if the world's hinge turned on their opinions, and measuring women as if kindness could be weighed on the same scale as plantain. Mary moved in the background like a cool shadow, setting down bowls, refilling cups, gathering bones from plates with fingers that never trembled. She said, "You're welcome," in a tone that sounded like closing a door softly rather than slamming it. She learned the rhythm of their arrival by the dust their slippers raised and the scent of their banter hurrying ahead, and she learned to leave the plates where laughter would not trip over them. On the nights when the moon looked like a coin forgotten on a table, Jonas's voice lifted above the rest, retelling the same victory at the mill, the same bargain at the market, the same nudge of fate that always, somehow, favored him. The friends nodded, because nodding is cheaper than truth, and because they understood that men sometimes climb the backs of their own stories just to appear taller. In those moments, Mary was a quiet coastline resisting the urge to collapse under the splash of waves. She breathed, she counted, she let pots simmer without spilling, and she folded away her words as carefully as Sunday clothes. What she began to notice, like a stain creeping through cloth, was the look that came into Jonas's eyes when Kobe teased him. How a joke hooked under his pride and tugged until he answered with a performance. How their laughter never bounced off him and died, but soaked into him and fermented. If the market teaches anything, it is that what you display is what is priced. Jonas was displaying the kind of man he believed they needed him to be, and the cost began to rise like floodwater pressing under doors. Redwater kept score without a ledger. A misplaced greeting could ripen into a rumor, a delayed apology into a proverb patiently waiting for the right mouth. On a Friday that smelled of rain and the soot of roasted corn, Mary took her basket to the market, and the market read her face like a headline, but withheld comment because her eyes offered no purchase for gossip. She priced dried fish, pressed soft tomatoes gently to learn their secrets, and bargained for onions that could keep their temper inside the pot. The women selling pepper liked her calm, the way she respected the labor of sun-darkened shoulders and hands whitened by cassava flour. Under a blue umbrella patched with silver tape, she met Mama Eben, who had once lived near Oshogbo and now sold spices with the memory of dramas she no longer repeated out loud. Mama Eben spoke in parables, measuring every advice with a laugh that kept it from sounding like a scold. "Water that refuses to boil," she said, weighing cloves, "is only teaching the fire patience." Mary smiled, and the smile was the shadow of a bird crossing a path. There, then gone, because she had learned to keep more inside than outside, to forgive little things quickly and store troubling things on a high shelf until the house was quiet enough to climb. That evening, the men returned to Jonas as moths return to light that has already burned their wings, and the jokes came scented with mockery, as sly as palm wine disguised in a soda bottle. Kobe clapped Jonas on the back and said a man must demonstrate authority like a radio demonstrates music, loud enough to drown nonsense. Elias whistled and said the head of the house is a crown that should be polished in public, otherwise it dulls. Robin laughed the big laugh that made children peek through fences, adding that women were happiest when shown their correct corner of the world. Jonas's chin lifted because their words braided themselves into a rope and tugged his pride forward. Mary stood by the doorway, listening to the street talk swagger into her home, and measured her silence bead by bead like a rosary. The pot of egusi thickened obediently, the fire licked the clay like a patient dog, and wrist by wrist she served them without spilling a drop, each plate a small miracle of balance in a house that was slowly tipping. That night, when the guests oiled the darkness with snores and the last charcoal surrendered to ash, Mary lay awake and let the fan's slow chop of air count the seconds between her heartbeat and her breath, learning that not answering an insult immediately does not mean the insult went unanswered. The afternoon that moved the needle did not announce itself with bells. It came simply, on feet dusty from the untarred road, carrying a sack of laughter that felt heavier than it sounded. Jonas and his friends were deep in an argument that wandered from Kano's dry harmattan to Port Harcourt's wet hustle, from the best suya in Kaduna to the loudest bar in Benin, and finally, inevitably, to the question of who among them had the firmest hand at home. Pride is a drum you can't beat gently. Once it begins, it wants a crowd. Kobe, swagger drawn like a machete from its sheath, teased Jonas about Mary's quiet, saying quiet women will test your door at night if you don't demonstrate your key by day. Elias, ever the tale carrier, narrated a scene in Enugu where a man allegedly tamed a stubborn wife with one public correction and saw peace grow like banana afterwards. Robin, whose laughter was sometimes a cover for debts he hid even from himself, slapped the bench and said leadership is like a lantern, you hang it high, so everyone recognizes where light comes from. Jonas, cheeks warmed by drink and the worship of shallow admiration, stood at the center of their circle like a masquerade summoned by careless drumming. His compound felt like a stage he hadn't realized he'd built, his marriage like a prop he now placed underfoot. Mary arrived with a tray of roasted plantain, pepper sauce glistening like wet rubies, and set it down without letting her eyes ask questions her mouth refused to voice. She turned to leave because staying would have made her complicit in nonsense. That was when Kobe laughed too loudly, leaning back until the stool groaned, and said if Mary were his, he would teach her to answer before being called, to stand where shown, to speak when pointed at like a market rooster. The others did not correct him, they chorused small approval like frogs after rain. The air grew tight as a knot. A silence walked into the room and sat between husband and wife, elbows wide. Jonas felt the eyes of his friends gathering, and in that gaze his pride searched for a ladder, any ladder, to climb. He reached toward the nail by the door where an old whip hung, more ornament than tool, a relic from the mill's animal days. His fingers paused there, perhaps waiting for wisdom to tap his wrist, perhaps hoping laughter would change subject. But laughter does not surrender ground easily, and men whose egos are hungry will feed them whatever is close. Mary watched the pause, watched the fingers close, watched a part of history step forward in her home, and felt a chill pass through the bones of the walls, as if the building had memory and protested. Redwater kept breathing outside. Goats tugged at their ropes, a hawker called Gary with a musical despair, thunder rolled somewhere behind the raffia roofs, and inside, a decision grew teeth. The night did not open like a palm with welcome. It curled itself instead, holding a stillness that hummed under the skin. The smell of roasted goat meat drifted from the clay hearth in the yard, sliding between the scent of wet earth from the afternoon drizzle and the sharp tang of palm wine that sweated in its gourd. The crickets carried on their own noisy courtship in the grass, their music falling in time with the men's laughter. Jonas had drunk enough to feel his own voice, as if it were something solid in the air, bouncing off the low mud walls and back into his ears with the satisfaction of ownership. His friends sprawled around the wooden table like kings without thrones, each man claiming his seat with elbows and half-empty cups. Mary moved through them quietly, her feet memorizing the spaces that avoided stray knees or carelessly dropped bones. Her wrapper was tied securely at her waist, blouse modest, hair wrapped in a head tie that told no story other than she had work to do. She placed a fresh plate of roasted meat in front of Jonas, the aroma clouding upward into their faces, and turned to leave without ceremony. That was when the teasing began again, Kobe's voice rolling like a drum from across the table, asking if Jonas was sure his wife knew who the head of the house was, his grin so wide it threatened to split his face. Laughter broke open in the circle, each man throwing a word into the air, each word landing like a pebble in Jonas's pride. He felt the heat rising up his neck, the need to prove himself swelling as though the night demanded tribute. His hand reached toward the doorpost where the whip hung, a strip of leather worn smooth from years of disuse, its handle polished by time more than touch. The sight of it made the men lean forward, their eyes glinting with anticipation, the firelight cutting their features into something sharper than humanity. Without looking at Mary, Jonas called her name, his voice loud enough to brush the roof. She stopped mid-step, her body still turned away from them, only her head moving slightly, waiting to hear what her husband required. He told her to come and stand before them, the way a schoolteacher might summon a late pupil to the front of the class. The air between them carried a charge now, like the space before a bolt of lightning falls. Mary walked forward slowly, the sound of her bare feet against the earth a quiet defiance, neither hurried nor dragging. Her eyes remained fixed on some invisible point beyond the fire, as if to remind herself that the scene unfolding was not her whole life, but only a moment she would one day place in its proper corner. She stopped before Jonas, the fire painting her face in strokes of orange and shadow, her mouth set in a line that held neither fear nor challenge. Jonas's hand lifted the whip, and in that lifting, time seemed to stretch, the sound of the crickets retreating to the edges of hearing. The first lash sliced the space between them with a whistle before landing across her shoulder, the pain blooming through her back like heat spilling from a furnace. A murmur of approval rose from the table. The second came faster, tearing at the edge of her wrapper, so that one knot loosened and the cloth shifted against her skin. By the third, the sting had moved beyond skin, becoming something deeper, a wound that knew it would not bleed in the way Jonas or his friends could see. She did not flinch in the way they expected. Her knees bent under her, yes, but her eyes remained steady, refusing the kind of collapse that would have been their final entertainment. The men laughed louder now, slapping the table, their joy a thing too large for the small yard, spilling into the street like spilt wine. Jonas, seeing their pleasure, felt something ugly settle into the pit of his stomach, but the mask of pride was not one he could remove without tearing skin. When it was over, Mary rose slowly, tying her wrapper back into place with deliberate care, the movement quiet but heavy with meaning. She met Jonas's eyes for the first time since he had called her, not rushing the gaze, letting it sit long enough for the night to notice. Then she turned her attention to each of the men seated around the table, their faces still bright with laughter, and in each case her gaze was as level and unblinking as water in a deep well. She neither spat nor shouted, did not curse them or wish them harm aloud, but the way her eyes moved told them they had each been seen fully and stored away somewhere they would not like to imagine. Without a word, she turned and walked into the house, her back straight, the door's wooden frame holding her departure like the final chord of a song no one expected to end. The men shifted in their seats after she left, some trying to keep the laughter alive, others finding their cups more interesting than the company. The fire spat once, a small ember leaping into the air before dying against the cool night. Jonas sat back down, his chest still heaving slightly, though he had done little more than lift his arm. The whip hung loosely from his hand for a moment, before he let it drop to the ground beside him. He felt the familiar taste of palm wine on his tongue, but it no longer carried the same ease. The noise of his friends continued, but for Jonas, a silence had already started forming under the table, between the cups, behind his ribs. That night, when the last of the embers cooled and the men finally stumbled out into the street, their voices low now, Jonas came inside to find Mary lying on the mat, her body turned away from the door. She was awake, he knew, because her breathing was too even, too intentional for sleep. He stood there for a moment, unsure whether to speak or let the distance between them remain unchallenged. In the end he said nothing, settling himself in his own corner of the mat, the air between them thick enough to slice. Mary stared into the dark, the pain in her back throbbing in rhythm with her heartbeat, but what occupied her mind was not the lashes or the sting. It was the knowledge that something had shifted in the room, something invisible yet permanent, like a wall moved half an inch without anyone's consent. She traced the thought carefully, feeling its edges, understanding it was not anger alone that kept her awake but something colder, something deliberate. It was the realization that while Jonas had his friends and their laughter to warm his pride, she had her silence, and silence, when kept long enough, can grow teeth sharper than any whip. By the time the cockerel crowed, announcing another day in Redwater, Mary had made a quiet place inside herself where the events of the night would live, not as an open wound, but as a seed. And seeds, when left alone in the dark, have a way of sprouting into things no one can control. Mary moved through the next mornings like someone walking on a narrow path beside a deep river, each step measured, each glance at the ground deliberate. She rose before the first smoke of cooking fires curled above the compound walls, swept the yard with strokes, so even they could have been drawn with a ruler, and tended to her chores with a grace that made it impossible to accuse her of idleness. Her back still carried faint marks, but she covered them as one covers a secret, tightly, without inviting curiosity. To Jonas, nothing seemed outwardly different. She answered when spoken to, cooked his meals with the same skill as before, even placed his favorite dried fish on the side of his pottage without being asked. But beneath the surface, her movements had a precision that spoke of calculation, as though each act of service was a stitch in a fabric he could not yet see. When Jonas's friends came again, she greeted them politely, her voice as calm as river water at dawn. She listened when they spoke, her head tilted just enough to suggest interest, but never so much as to seem eager. She began to ask small questions, about Kobe's mother in Abaddon, Elias's plans for his eldest son, Robin's business near the Warri docks. They answered readily, not suspecting anything beyond neighborly concern. And Mary listened, storing away their words as a farmer stores seed yams, knowing the right season would come. Over time, she began to lengthen her visits to the market. What once took her an hour now took 2, and she returned not only with food but with knowledge. At the yam stall, she overheard women complaining about Elias's unpaid debts to a trader in Uyo. At the fish seller's table, a man mentioned seeing Kobe in a heated argument with a moneylender from Abaddon. Near the pepper heap, Robin's wife spoke in low tones to her cousin about bruises she hid under long sleeves. Mary did not insert herself into these conversations. She simply let her hands busy themselves with picking vegetables, nodding at the right moments, her eyes lowered so her interest would appear casual. In Redwater, news did not travel. It floated like pollen in dry season, settling where the air was stillest. Mary knew how to make herself that still place. When she passed by the chief's courtyard one afternoon, she stopped to greet the guards, offering them roasted groundnuts from her basket. Her words were light, about the weather and the price of palm oil, but she lingered just long enough for them to notice her. Later that week, she returned, this time with a calabash of zobo for the chief's wife, explaining it was from the same hibiscus plants she grew behind her kitchen. Each visit was framed as kindness, but her eyes weighed every detail, the way the chief liked his stories told, the people who came and went, the ease with which small talk could become testimony. The more Mary learned, the less she spoke at home. Jonas, mistaking her quiet for submission, grew bolder in his conversations with his friends, retelling the night of the flogging with exaggerated gestures, as if it were a folk tale about his strength. Each time, she served their drinks without expression, her mind not on the words but on the audience. She noticed how they leaned in when Jonas spoke, how they laughed hardest when the details were most humiliating for her, and how their eyes occasionally darted toward her to see if she would react. She never gave them that satisfaction. Her silence became a mirror they could not read. What Jonas failed to notice was that while his pride was busy performing, Mary was mapping connections. Who spoke to whom in the market, which trader had a grudge against which customer, which debts had been hidden from wives, and which favors had been quietly exchanged behind closed doors. In Redwater, a single well-timed question could set a story rolling downhill faster than a cart on a slope. Mary was asking those questions, but never in the same place twice, never to the same person in the same way. Weeks passed before the threads she'd been gathering began to twist together. One morning, while washing clothes at the stream, she found herself beside the chief's youngest wife, who was known for her fondness for conversation. The woman spoke freely about the chief's concern over disorder in the town, about debts, disputes, and men who made trouble after drinking too much. Mary listened, wringing out a wrapper until it dripped clear water, then let slip that she had heard small things about certain men who met in her compound. She spoke as though reluctant, as though revealing it only out of duty. The younger wife's eyes sharpened. Mary did not give names, she didn't need to. She knew the woman would carry the hint back to the chief, and that once the chief's curiosity was stirred, others would step forward to feed it. That evening, Mary returned home as she always did, setting dinner before Jonas without comment. He ate heartily, boasting about a day's work at the mill, never noticing the way her eyes rested on him for a moment longer than usual before turning away. The river that looks calm at the surface can still carry a current strong enough to pull a man under, and Mary's current had begun to move. The evening she chose was one of those nights when Redwater seemed to breathe slower, the heat of the day still clinging to the mud walls while a thin wind teased at the edges of the guava leaves. Jonas had returned from the mill in a good mood, his shirt damp from the sweat of labor, but his voice warm with satisfaction, and when he found Mary busy over a pot in the yard, he was quick to call out to her to ensure the men would eat well that night. She nodded without turning from the pot, the steam clouding around her head like a quiet crown, the scent of goat meat and yam pottage already curling through the compound. By the time the first of Jonas's friends arrived, the table was already set with calabashes of palm wine from Nui and platters of fried plantain draped in spicy sauce. The men entered in high spirits, their talk spilling over each other's words, stories of the day's bargains and half-told jokes interrupted by greetings and backslaps. Jonas beamed as if their presence proved something about his own standing, his pride sitting taller than the stools they took. Mary served them with practiced ease, her eyes meeting theirs only in brief, polite glances. Her hands moved without hesitation, filling cups, setting down plates, and gathering empty ones before they could clutter the table. The men ate with the eagerness of travelers arriving at a long-anticipated destination, the meat tearing easily beneath their fingers, the yam soaking up sauce that burned just enough to draw sweat. Between mouthfuls, Jonas began his usual boasting, recounting not only his day at the mill but also his authority at home, the words coming faster as the palm wine loosened his tongue. The others encouraged him with laughter and nods, leaning closer as if the warmth of his words could add to the heat already radiating from the food. And Mary, sitting just beyond the circle of their bodies, poured more wine into their cups and said nothing, her face composed into the kind of calm that gives no hint of its purpose. It was after the plates had been cleared and the calabashes refilled that Jonas steered the conversation toward the memory he had begun to treat like a prized story. He described the night of the flogging with the exaggerated movements of a man who believes his audience is there to applaud him, his hand mimicking the arc of the whip, his mouth curling around the imagined sound of leather striking skin. Kobe slapped the table, Elias leaned back to release a whistle, and Robin laughed with his head tilted toward the sky. Mary's hands were steady as she poured for each man, the gourd in her hand tilting just enough to fill their cups without spilling. When she set the last calabash down, she straightened and said, almost lightly, "Ah, today I was at the chief's house." The words fell into their laughter like a stone into still water, the ripples touching each man in turn. Jonas glanced at her, his smile twitching but holding. "Chief's house?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of curiosity he did not mean to show. Mary nodded, as if discussing the price of palm oil. "We talked for a while. About small things, documents, witnesses. You know how the chief likes to hear from his people." She moved to fetch another gourd of wine before anyone could press her further, leaving the air behind her heavy with unspoken questions. The men shifted in their seats, their laughter stumbling over itself before finding a more subdued rhythm. Jonas forced a chuckle, calling after her to bring the roasted groundnuts, but his eyes followed her until she disappeared through the doorway. Outside the walls of the compound, a dog barked once and fell silent, and in that quiet, Each man felt the shape of the unease that had entered the room. When she returned, she carried the groundnuts and another platter of plantain, setting them down with the same careful movements as before, but her silence now pressed harder against the edges of the table. Jonas tried to reclaim the conversation, turning to Elias for a story about his trip to Enugu, but Elias's mind was elsewhere, his smile thin and distracted. Kobe picked at the plantain without appetite, and Robin refilled his own cup without waiting for Mary's hand. The taste of the wine seemed different now, its sweetness muted by the weight of the moment. Mary, for her part, moved through the yard with unhurried steps, collecting the empty calabashes and brushing crumbs from the stools, her expression as even as when she had first served the meal. Yet beneath her composure, her mind traced the threads she had been weaving for weeks, watching them tighten with every passing second. She knew the chief's name was one that carried weight in every corner of Redwater. To mention it carelessly was to strike a match near dry grass. The men might not yet understand the full shape of what she had done, but they understood enough to be uneasy. And unease, she knew, was the first step toward mistakes. By the time the evening began to thin, the laughter had shrunk to polite bursts, and the talk had shifted to safer topics: market prices, the weather, the latest match between rival football clubs. Mary continued to serve them as though nothing had changed, her movements fluid, her voice low but courteous. When the men finally stood to leave, their goodbyes were shorter than usual, their eyes avoiding hers for longer than politeness required. Jonas walked them to the gate, clapping each on the shoulder, assuring them they would gather again soon. But when he returned to the yard, Mary was already clearing the last of the dishes, stacking them in a neat pile beside the basin. He watched her for a moment, searching her face for something he could name, but found nothing he could hold on to. She rinsed her hands in the basin, the water swirling away the last of the oil and spice, then straightened and met his gaze with a calm that did not invite questions. The whip had been his weapon that night weeks ago, but Mary's was quieter, slower, and far sharper. And though Jonas could not yet see it, the trap she had set was already closing around him. The morning after the gathering began without ceremony, but its silence was of the sort that carried meaning if one listened carefully. The first sign that something in Redwater had shifted came when two of the chief's guards, dressed in their dark wrappers and with their spears tapping lightly against the packed earth, appeared at Jonas's compound before the sun had risen high. They came not with the urgent stomp of soldiers, but with the steady steps of men who knew their presence alone was enough to turn heads. Behind them trailed a few curious neighbors, their morning chores temporarily forgotten in the interest of seeing whose name the day had called. Jonas stepped out from the doorway, his brows furrowed in confusion, wiping his hands on his shorts as if he had been caught halfway between tasks. The taller guard greeted him politely but without warmth, delivering a short message from the chief. He was to come to the courtyard before noon, and he should prepare to answer questions about certain matters of conduct and debt. Jonas laughed awkwardly, glancing toward the neighbors who pretended to busy themselves with imaginary errands, but his laugh did not find a reply in the guards' faces. Mary, standing in the shadow of the doorway, said nothing, her eyes fixed on the ground as though she were counting the pebbles there. The guards left as quietly as they had come, but the mark of their visit clung to the compound like smoke after a cooking fire. Jonas muttered to himself as he returned inside, convincing himself it was a misunderstanding, that perhaps the chief wanted to discuss the mill or some other harmless affair. But in a place like Redwater, the chief's summons was never without reason, and reason, once stirred, had a way of unearthing more than what it was sent to find. By midday, the whispers had thickened into something more solid, wrapping themselves around the names of Jonas, Elias, Kobe, and Robin like vines eager to climb. In the market, a woman selling pepper told another by the fish stall that she had heard Elias owed more than 3 months' wages to a trader in Uyo, and that the trader had already sent word to the chief. Near the palm wine stand, two men argued over whether it was true that Kobe had been seen in the company of river traders, known for smuggling goods through the mangroves at night. At the stream, where women bent over basins and gossiped between rings of wet cloth, Robin's wife spoke more openly than before, her voice trembling but steadying with each sentence, about the nights when his hands had left marks she had learned to hide under her wrappers. Each story was like a spark falling into dry grass, and the more they spread, the more the air in Redwater seemed to crackle with anticipation. Mary moved among these places without drawing attention, her basket balanced on her head, her face a mask of everyday calm. She bought tomatoes, she fetched water, she greeted elders with the same measured courtesy she had always shown. But beneath that calm, she was listening, taking note of how quickly her seeds had taken root. She did not need to speak. The stories were carrying themselves now, passed from one mouth to another, each retelling adding weight until the truth, however it was shaped, could no longer be ignored. By the time the chief sat in his courtyard that evening, the web had already drawn its prey to the center. Jonas arrived at the courtyard with his friends, each man walking with the stiff posture of someone determined not to show weakness, though their eyes betrayed the tension gnawing at their thoughts. The chief sat on a low stool carved from Morocco, his expression neither welcoming nor hostile, flanked by elders whose faces were unreadable save for the flicker of interest in their eyes. Around the edges of the open space, villagers had gathered, pretending to pass through but lingering just long enough to catch pieces of what was said. The chief began with questions about the debts, how Elias planned to repay them, why Kobe had been dealing with traders who skirted the town's laws, whether Robin had any answer to his wife's accusations. One by one, the men stumbled over their replies, their earlier bravado shriveling under the weight of the chief's gaze. Then the chief turned to Jonas, his voice lowering just enough to draw the listeners closer in spirit if not in body. He asked about the night with the whip, about the gathering of friends in his yard, about the example such behavior set for the rest of Redwater. Jonas tried to laugh it off, to frame it as nothing more than harmless discipline in the presence of trusted companions, but the chief's face did not move. He reminded Jonas that a man's home is not a stage for cruelty, and that a leader in his own house is expected to protect, not perform. With each sentence, Jonas felt the invisible ground beneath his feet tilt. The elders murmured among themselves, the crowd shifted, and though no judgment was declared that day, the verdict had already begun to take shape in the minds of those watching. The weeks that followed were like a slow unraveling. Jonas's position at the mill was given to another man, one whose name had never been called in the chief's courtyard. Merchants at the market began refusing him credit, offering polite excuses about stock shortages when he tried to buy on trust. Children who once greeted him with laughter now watched him from a distance, their eyes wide and uncertain. Elias found his creditors less patient, their demands arriving with sharper words and fewer smiles. Kobe's dealings by the river became more difficult as traders began avoiding him, unwilling to risk their own standing. Robin's wife moved back to her mother's compound in a neighboring village, taking their children with her and leaving him to pace his yard alone at night. Mary moved through this changing landscape with the same quiet rhythm as before, cooking Jonas's meals, sweeping the yard, greeting neighbors without excess warmth or coldness. She offered no gloating, no sharp words to remind him of how he had arrived at this place. But in the silences between them, in the way she met his eyes only briefly before turning away, Jonas felt the weight of something he could not name, a weight that seemed heavier than shame, more lasting than anger. It was the knowledge that his fall had not come from a sudden blow, but from the steady pressure of something he had not seen until it was too late. And in that knowledge, he understood that there would be no undoing what had been done. The months that followed did not arrive trumpeting change. They came on soft sols, setting down their weight one quiet day after another until the house felt rearranged by hands no one saw. Jonas woke before dawn now, not to boast of early rising, but because sleep was a thin cloth that refused to warm him. The mill no longer answered his footsteps, so he mended fences for neighbors who did not meet his eyes and carried water for an old carpenter whose voice had once carried his name like praise. The compound had learned caution. Children who had practiced drumming on their knees when he passed now slipped around him like water edging a stone. Mary kept to her rhythm, washing, cooking, tending the small garden that lined the back wall, staking okra and coaxing scent leaf to spread. She spoke when speech was necessary, answered with yes or no when questions required shape, offered a steady hand when the old woman next door faltered on uneven ground. On Sundays, she wrapped her head tie with a neatness that made the fabric look newly woven, lingered after worship to ask after Mama Eben's knees, and carried home small bags of groundnuts to roast later when the evening cooled the walls. Once, when rain had washed the earth into a pattern of bronze and black, a trader from Lagos knocked at the gate to ask directions to the highway. Mary stepped outside and pointed, describing landmarks in a voice that gave the traveler confidence, while Jonas watched from the doorway, struck by how the world leaned toward her without demanding anything dramatic in return. A second letter arrived from a cousin in Owerri asking whether Redwater's markets favored plantain or yam this season, Mary wrote back with neat lines, spared adjectives, and a small story about the price of fish rising when the river silted after a storm. Jonas saw the envelope on the table and felt a pang he could not name, an ache shaped like a man trying to belong to his own house. He began to tidy things unasked, putting away tools where they belonged, washing his cup instead of leaving it near the basin, folding his wrapper so it did not spill over the stool. When he tried to explain himself, words piled up uselessly. Mary did not ask for explanation, and absolution was not a dish he could order from any kitchen. In the evenings, when heat softened into a breeze that smelled faintly of wet earth and kerosene, he sat under the guava and listened to sounds that used to be background. Mortars thudding like slow heartbeats, a goat testing its rope, someone far off practicing a hymn for an upcoming funeral. He realized his life had been a parade that began and ended in his own mouth, a fanfare he had mistaken for belonging. Now silence had moved into the spare room and paid rent on time, and his pride, which once strutted like a cockerel at dawn, plucked its own feathers to keep from shivering. It was on one such evening that the past, which had been hiding behind the hibiscus, decided to step into the yard with shoes on. Elias arrived first, thinner than Jonas remembered, his shoulders carrying the shrug of a man in negotiations with humility. He asked for water and accepted it with both hands, drinking as if thirst had manners. Kobe came next, dressed in clothes that pretended at plenty, but bore the small betrayals of frayed threads and careful stitching at the hems. He smiled too quickly and looked over his shoulder as though conversation had become an occupational hazard. Robin hovered at the gate, tapping the frame with his knuckles, his eyes asking for permission his mouth could not form. Mary wiped her hands on her wrapper and stepped aside so they could enter, setting down a second stool near the door and moving the basin so no one would trip. Jonas's stomach tightened because the last time these men had filled his yard, laughter had been armor, and he had worn it until it refused to come off. Now they sat as neighbors whose roofs had learned the dialect of rain. There was talk of weather, of a trader from Calabar who cheated with thumb weight on the scale, of a mill in a township beyond Jos that had new machines which clanged like church bells. The words wandered until they found the reason for their visit without anyone exactly guiding them there. Elias cleared his throat and spoke of debts paid in coins and others paid in quiet surrender. Kobe murmured that he had carried a swagger like a shield only to discover it was a drum, loud, hollow, and easy to break. Robin's mouth formed a confession and abandoned it, hanging open like a window that a gust had snatched. Jonas said little. He watched Mary set down roasted groundnuts, a bowl of sliced garden eggs, and a small dish of pepper mixed with palm oil, knew that this hospitality carried no flag of reconciliation, just the basic civility of a house that refused to become a jungle. Elias finally asked for a word with Mary alone, his voice bending at the edges. She listened in the open yard, because she had no conversation to hide, and he spoke of the chief, of wife beating herd, and recorded not on paper, but in the tongues of those who had grown tired of silence. He asked, clumsily, almost as a man stealing his own question, whether she could say to the chief's wife that they were trying to be new men. Mary's face did not move. She told him the chief listened to evidence, and to change that could be seen without a guide. Kobe, fingers rubbing his knee as if searching for a smooth spot, asked whether time had a key for locks like theirs. Mary's gaze settled on the whip that Jonas had stored at the bottom of a chest and never touched again. Time does not unlock doors, she said quietly. It makes new walls. Later that week, a letter arrived for Jonas on stiff paper that smelled faintly of dust and ink, with the chief's seal pressed in red at the bottom. It asked him to attend a meeting at the courtyard with 2 elders and a visiting clerk from the district office, a man whose spectacles gave him the serene impatience of someone who believed problems yielded when properly enumerated. Jonas dressed with care, choosing a wrapper without stains and a shirt whose buttons all agreed to cooperate, then walked the road with a pace that respected the gravity of what waited ahead without pretending he could hurry wisdom. The courtyard was as he remembered, a sweep of compacted earth shaded by an almond tree, whose leaves seemed to gossip with light. The chief sat with the clerk and the elders, and to one side stood 3 women whose faces Jonas knew but had rarely studied. Robin's wife with her new composure, a trader whose banter at her stall disguised the mathematics she did in her head, and the mill worker's sister who had started a small cooperative after her brother was cheated of his wages. The clerk spoke first, unfurling language like a measuring tape, explaining a new registry for disputes, a schedule of fines, a practice of written agreements that would bear witness in their own ink. This was not a court, he said, but a doorway toward something sturdier than rumor. The chief added that men who wished to lead in their homes must agree to be led by the law when they forgot themselves. He looked at Jonas and asked if he could live inside such a frame. Jonas realized the question was not for performance. It requested a kind of dignity he had not practiced. He said yes, and yes again, and when asked to sign he wrote his name slowly, careful with each letter as if drawing water from a well by hand. On his way out, the almond tree dropped a leaf that brushed his shoulder. Robin's wife met his eye and did not look away. The clerk shook his hand and said that written things were not miracles but mirrors. They showed you if you had dirt on your face, and whether you bothered to wash was your choice. Jonas walked home with the paper folded and tucked like a small animal in his pocket, and for the first time in a long while, the road seemed to meet his feet halfway instead of waiting for him to plead. When Mary returned from the market that evening, the sun was lowering itself with ceremony, staining the sky with a patience that made even hurried people slow down at the gate. She carried smoked fish, a small sachet of curry, and 2 limes that rolled into the corner of her basket as if hiding from the knife they knew would find them later. Jonas swept the yard and set the basin before she asked, then told her about the meeting in a voice that kept its volume modest, as though loudness might bruise the fragile thing he was describing. He did not promise change because promises from him had learned to sound like empty calabashes. He described the papers, the clerk, the elder whose cough kept time with the clerk's sentences, the way the chief's eyes held a question and did not hurry his answer. Mary listened, placing fish on the rack, fanning the charcoal until it glowed like disciplined embers. When the first curl of smoke rose sweet and steady, she said that paper would not teach a hand to soften, but could remind it to pause. She added salt to the pot the way some people add memory to stories, without measuring, trusting the years in their wrists. Jonas nodded, but the nod was not a plea. It was an acknowledgement that he had entered a room he did not know how to furnish yet. As they ate, crickets stitched sound into the darkness, and somewhere beyond the wall a child practiced pronouncing the name of a city she had only seen on a map, spelling out Sokoto slowly, while an older brother corrected the syllables. A breeze carried the distant scent of rain, and the guava rustled as if searching its pockets for old coins. When they finished, Mary washed the bowls, her hands working in the cool water with a rhythm that had never deserted her. Jonas stood beside her and dried each bowl without attempting conversation, understanding that some things healed like bone. Set once, left alone, checked for strength only after time had passed. Before sleep, he took the whip from the bottom of the chest and, without ceremony, cut it into quiet pieces with a knife whose edge had no appetite for drama. He buried the leather in the garden between okra and scent leaf, pressing the earth flat with his palm, as if closing the eyes of a stubborn ghost. Mary saw the darker patch of soil and said nothing. In the morning, when dawn came wearing its ordinary clothes, a small shoot had pushed up where the handle lay hidden. Not a miracle, not a sign, just a green insistence that life could grow in unlikely places if left undisturbed. My advice to you is this: never mistake silence for weakness, and never use love as a stage for cruelty. Respect in the home is not built by fear. It is built by kindness, and once broken, it is harder to rebuild than the strongest wall. What you give to others will find its way back to you, whether it is care or harm, so plant wisely. May your home be filled with peace that no quarrel can scatter. May your words bring healing and not wounds. May your hands never be used to destroy what you love. May your dignity grow like a tree planted by the river, always green, always strong. May you be surrounded by people who lift you higher, and may you never fall into the company of those who push you toward shame. May your days be long, your nights be calm, and your joy be full. If you believe it, say a big amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.